Hi guys, welcome back to our little cottage here on the river in the far north of Idaho. In this video, I am going to share with you my recipe for rustic apple pie and my all butter pie crust. And this last week was my husband's birthday, and every year he requests a homemade apple pie for his birthday. So this is the recipe that I make. So first I'm starting out by preparing the pie crust, and it's simply 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour with 1 teaspoon of salt and 2 tablespoons of sugar. And I'm just going to whisk that all together, and then I take cold butter, not room temperature but cold, and I grate it into, and so I'm doing 2 sticks of butter, which is 1 cup, and I'm grating it into the flour mixture. And this grating it makes it so much easier to cut into the flour. And so I used to, cut it into little squares and try and use a pastry cutter, but I have found that grating it like this makes it so much easier and a much quicker process as well. And then I simply use my hands and I just work it into the flour mixture. And you want to do this fairly quickly. You don't want to spend a ton of time doing this because you don't want your butter to get warm. And so I just kind of mix it together until it is a crumb consistency. And here I'll kind of show you where the consistency that I like to get it to. And sometimes I'll rub it between my hands a little bit if there's some bigger chunks. But here is the crumb consistency. And then you're going to take very cold water, and the water that comes out of our tap is already very cold because it's spring water. So I just get it straight out of my tap, but I'm going to do 7 tablespoons of cold water, and you're kind of going to use between 6 to 8 tablespoons, just depending on how dry the dough is. There's just a couple different factors, but I usually end up doing about 7. Sometimes I'll end up with 8 if it's way too dry. But anyway, so then this I also mix with my hands and just get it together. Now you could do this in a food processor, which I have done before, but I don't currently have a food processor. If I had one, I probably would do it that way, just because it I don't know, keeps your hands clean. But anyway, this way works just as well. And again, you kind of want to work quickly. You don't want to spend a lot of time handling the dough because you don't want it to warm up, and you also don't want it to get tough, because if you handle it too much, then it is going to get tough, and you want a nice, tender, flaky pie crust. And so then once it just comes together, I then cut it into 2 equal parts and get them into these little discs that I will wrap in plastic wrap. And then I will put these into the fridge for at least an hour. These can stay in the fridge for a couple days ahead of time. So if you want to do some Thanksgiving prep and make your pie crust a few days ahead of time, you can totally do that with this. This also freezes, so you can wrap this in the plastic wrap, put them in a Ziploc bag, and throw them in the freezer for up to a month. So really nice that you can kind of prep all of your holiday pie crust in advance. But anyway, it's going to need to go in the fridge for at least an hour so it's nice and chilled. And so here I am prepping the apple pie filling, and you want to use Granny Smith apples because you want that little bit of tartness. It just goes so well in an apple pie. And so I used 7 Granny Smith apples, and here I have my little apple peeler that also cores the apples and slices them. And it's a lovely little gadget. I got it on Amazon a long time ago, so I know you can get them on Amazon. It definitely just makes this process a lot quicker and simpler, but you don't have to have it. You can peel the apples the old-fashioned way, I guess this is kind of an old-fashioned way, but I mean, I guess I should say by hand. You can peel your apples with a knife or a vegetable peeler and then core them, you know, but I have to say this little device is amazing. And then once your apples are ready, you're going to prepare the sugar mixture for the apple pie filling. And you're going to do a half a cup of granulated sugar and half a cup of packed brown sugar. And then to this, you're going to add about half a teaspoon of salt, and I use kosher salt. And then you're also going to add in cinnamon, and I did 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. And then I also added fresh nutmeg, so freshly grated nutmeg. And I don't really know exactly how much nutmeg it ended up being, but I want to say it was between a 1/4 teaspoon and half a teaspoon of freshly grated nutmeg. And I think it has to be freshly grated. Obviously, you could use pre-ground, but there is just something so incredible about using freshly grated nutmeg in recipes. And then you're also going to add in a 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour to help thicken everything while the pie is baking. And then you're just going to whisk this all together until it is nice and incorporated, and then you're going to add it to your big bowl of apples. I like to use my hands for this because you can really get in there and make sure all of the sugar mixture gets well coated onto the apples. And then from here, I pulled the pie crust out of the fridge, just one of the rounds, and I'm going to flour my workspace just to make sure that the pie crust does not stick. And I'm also going to add a little flour to the dough and my rolling pin. And then I'm going to roll this out, and it takes a little bit of elbow grease at first because it is so firm from being chilled. And you just want to do little turns to try and keep it as round as possible. I still struggle with this. I need to take a pie crust making class or something because I can never get it perfectly round. And yeah, so anyways, But as long as it's big enough and it fits over your pie dish, it's totally fine. So then I use the rolling pin to pick up the pie crust. I just kind of roll it up onto the rolling pin and then roll it back out over the pie dish. And inevitably there's just a few little cracks, actually more like tears. And so I'll just use some of the extra, the hangover parts of the dough. That's what you call them. And I just use those to kind of fix any little spots that need a little extra dough, and it works out fine. And that's why I call this a rustic apple pie, because it's not perfect, and that's okay because it still turns out delicious, and I think it still looks beautiful because it's so rustic. So anyways, and then I just use some scissors to kind of trim off the extras. And then I'm going to roll out the second pie crust and get that all ready to go over the top of the apple pie. The apples are going to be mounted pretty high, but that's what we want because they will cook down some while they're baking. So you do want them to be kind of mounted high. And then you're just going to repeat the process with the pie crust using the rolling pin to get it onto the top of the pie. And as you can see, there were just some more tears, and so I just had to kind of work with them and put things back together. And then I trimmed again the extras and got those all trimmed off. And then I'm going to use a fork for crimping the edges. And I know people have different techniques and different styles for this, but I kept this very simple and just used a fork. And I remember my mom used a fork a lot to crimp her pie crust when she would make a 2 crust pie like this. And so I just kind of made sure everything was just kind of tucked in nicely, and then used the fork to crimp around the edges. And then here I just used the fork to poke some holes in the top of the pie crust. You can use a knife to cut slits, but I remember my mom always using a fork in the tops of her pie crust. So that's what I did this time around. And this just lets the steam out while the pie is baking. And then I made a very simple egg wash to put on the pie crust, and this was just 1 egg with about 2 or 3 tablespoons of water whisked together. And I couldn't find my pastry brush, and so I just took a paper towel and folded it up and used that to brush the top of the pie with the egg wash, and that worked just fine. A brush would have been better, but this, in a pinch, this totally worked. And so then I just brushed the egg wash over the top of the entire pie, and the oven had been preheating to 400 degrees. I lined a cookie sheet with some parchment paper to put the pie on while baking so that any bubbling over did not get into my oven. And I got this into the oven at 400 degrees for 20 minutes to start. And then after 20 minutes, I lowered the temperature of the oven to 375 degrees and baked for another 40 minutes or so. And here is the finished apple pie. And I did put a piece of foil over the top of it with about 20 minutes left of baking to go, just so the edges wouldn't burn. So just keep that in mind, that you may have to put a piece of foil over the top. And then I put it onto a wire rack to cool to room temperature, and we went out to dinner for his birthday. And then when we got home, it was ready to be served. And I served it with some vanilla bean ice cream, but you could also just serve it with some whipped cream. And it was a big hit. So I will have the recipe for the apple pie and the pie crust linked in the description box below to my blog, homespunannie.com. And I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will talk to you guys in the next video.